She agreed to become what she was called the bag lady in Watergate. She would, at a prearranged time, she would go to a phone booth in Potomac Village nearby and wait for a call that was going to come at, let's say 11 p.m. I went with her on 2 occasions at these calls. The phone would ring. She had her .25 automatic pistol with her, and it was deathly quiet and really spooky and scary. And the phone would ring, she'd go to the phone and pick it up and then nod her head or say yes and then hang up, and we'd go back to the house. She'd drop me off and then she'd head over to wherever the location was, let's say a Greyhound station in Washington, D.C. And at a specific phone booth there would be taped a key underneath the phone itself, and that would correspond to a locker. That opening the locker would be a satchel or a bag, and there would be the money in it. There's my mother, Dorothy, at about that time of her life. And so her charge of being a bag lady was really wearing on her. She was frightened. She said she was being followed. She didn't know who was following her, but she felt that her life was in grave danger. And she had it. In December of 1972, Watergate was just, the pressure was building and building. And I had a lot of very dear conversations, deep conversations with my mother about what was going on in Watergate. And she decided she was going to go to Chicago. She had $2 million in traveler's checks and $10,500 in cash. She was going to pay off a man in Chicago named Michael Stevens, who had built these wiretapping devices for the Watergate entry team. That flight never landed properly. It crashed in a neighborhood adjacent to the Midway landing lane. The events that happened directly when that flight crashed grew to be bothersome to me. I'd just like to list them sort of one by one. Certainly the most obvious involvement of higher-ups was that in less than 24 hours, on December 9th, Richard Nixon, president at the time, appointed one of his top aides, Eagle Crow, to head to become Under Secretary of Transportation, which is the governing body over the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, and they're the ones that investigate that crash. So now we have Nixon's top guy with control of the investigation. The second thing that aroused my curiosity was that the FBI had 50 agents on the ground within 40 minutes of that plane crash. And this was unheard of, even by FBI standards. And in fact, John Reed, head of the NTSB, wrote a letter to William Ruckelshaus, who was the acting chief of the FBI, asking for clarification in these details. Why was there 50 FBI agents there? Why did they go to the Midway Tower and listen to the tape recordings? Why did they interrogate witnesses on the ground? All activities that were not official FBI behavior. And in response to that, Ruckelshaus wrote back to John Reed saying that in fact FBI does have jurisdiction in connection with the destruction of aircraft. So that's telling me that the FBI had some knowledge that something was going to happen to this crash. And he said, and this is quoting in his letter, he said, Section 32 U.S. Code pertaining to the willful damaging, destroying, or disabling of any civilian aircraft pertaining to aircraft piracy, interference with flight crew members, assault, murder, manslaughter, and attempts to commit murder or manslaughter. And so right there, the FBI was either complicit in the crash of that flight or they had advanced knowledge of something going to happen to that flight. The mishandling of that plane is just a either gross negligence by both towers or the way that they brought that plane down. In the final 15 minutes of that flight, the flight recorder in the tail of the United Airlines Boeing 737 failed. The air data computer also malfunctioned. The captain is heard in the recording saying, "Sounds to me a circuit breaker." Visibility was about 1 to 2 miles, ceiling varied from 400 to 600 feet. The National Weather Service runway visual range recorder was turned off. The outer markers, the blue lights that you see when you land, they were turned off. The flight at that point the controls were shorting out in the cockpit for unknown reasons. And there was a gross cross communication between O'Hare Tower and Midway Tower, where they were both giving the flight a contradictory landing information. And just moments prior to that plane crashing, they steered a two-propeller, small-engine aircraft directly in the path of that big Boeing plane. And that's what ultimately caused the plane to stall and to crash. And that Boeing then just scooted out of there. It was an aerial commander with the tail numbers of N309VS. This is all information that's available and to view in the official National Transportation and Safety Board second inquiry into that flight. I think the reason that they brought that flight down when they did was because on board that flight beside my mother, and of course she had the evidence that Nixon feared, but on board was Michelle Clark, a CBS anchorwoman, who had agreed, along with my mother, to have a press conference. My mother was just completely fed up with everything, and she was going to blow Nixon out of the White House. That was the threat that a week before they had made directly to Charles Colson at the White House. So there was no doubt in my mind that they knew that something had to be done. People say, well, it doesn't make any sense why they would take a whole airplane out in order to silence one person. They wanted to keep my dad quiet, and I say that that's classic CIA procedure. If they had just killed my mother, where would the investigation point to? It would be towards my mother. If you take an entire plane out, or an apartment, or houses on the ground, where is the investigation going to point to? It's going to point out to an entire plane. It's going to be diffused, and that's a classic CIA operational tactic for murder and assassination. I don't know who killed my mother, who brought that plane down, who gave the instruction, but clearly with all the coincidental activities that came right after that flight, there was CIA White House was all over that flight. The evidence my mother had was canceled checks which linked directly to the committee to re-elect the president, which showed that money coming from the White House financed the Watergate burglaries, and also the memos and cables my father had showing that President Nixon was part of the White House green lighting of Operation 40. Now, Nixon feared that when people found out that he approved of a political assassination, that wasn't going to look too good for him, and it could have caused his impeachment at that time. Let's see, there's me and my sister and my dad at the Watergate hearings. There's my sister and I at the hearings in support of our dad. And there's a montage of my mother and the downed United Flight 553. I just can only say that I think because my mother took out a $250,000 insurance policy just prior to that flight, that she knew that there was a strong chance she might not come back from that flight. And I think because of the pain she was in, both emotionally and physically, she had her back broken twice earlier in years, I think she gallantly gave her life to save her children. Because years later, when my father confided to me on his deathbed, not only the things about JFK, but about the fact that all this time he felt that she had been murdered and it wasn't just pilot error, that made my hair stand on end. And it was a very, very sincere moment between my father and I. He was so old and so frail and dying. He gripped my hand with such ferocity, and his eyes welled up in tears, and he just said, I couldn't protect you. I was in prison, and I couldn't protect you kids after what they had done to your mother. And I leaned over and I whispered in his ear, don't forget Dorothy. Don't forget Dorothy. And he just gripped my hand, and we both just you know, it was just a very touching moment between the two of us. And I don't know, that's about all I can say. I don't know who pulled the trigger at JFK, and I don't know who ordered my mother's plane to be crashed, but I do know that, that these two events are linked, and as a legacy to my wonderful mother, Dorothy, I'm happy that I've been invited to speak here on this day in front of so many good people as yourselves. Many of you were becoming friends every year when we come to these occasions. And I want to add also that from here we're going to go to Dealey Plaza, and we're going to honor the legacy of President Kennedy with 52 seconds of silence. And I'll be there with you guys. If you come with us, we'd be very honored and grateful to have you come along. Thank you.
Like I said earlier, both St. John and I are musicians, and St. John is going to play here in town tonight. He's going to be at the Rafter Rattlers. Well, and he's going to play with the Ratter Rattlers at the E-Spirit Fine Wines and Ales and Spirits, and that's going to start at 8 o'clock. And Lorian out there does have the address if you guys want to go. Okay? And now I'm going to introduce Mr. John B. Wells, who introduced me earlier, okay? And aren't we lucky to have him here, okay? And he has, you know, through his kind